It was meant to be a simple photograph, a young nurse, smiling in the sunlight, captured forever in the summer of 1943. But if you look just past her shoulder, you'll see him, a man no one remembers meeting, a man who wasn't listed in any hospital records, a man who, some experts now believe, shouldn't have been there at all. For 80 years, the question has remained the same. Who was he? And why was he looking straight into the camera? The screen begins in total darkness, with only the faint hiss of static in the background. Slowly, an old black and white wartime photograph fades into view, as though it's emerging from another lifetime. In it, a young nurse stands in the sunlight, her cap perfectly positioned, her uniform crisp despite the chaos of 1943. She's smiling. Not a wide grin, but something small, reserved, almost shy. The light hits her face gently, making her seem untouched by the horrors of war. Behind her, buildings blur into the distance, their edges softened by the camera's lens. But just to her right, barely noticeable at first, stands another figure. A tall silhouette, still, watching, and the moment you see him, you can't unsee him. The man in the background is unlike anyone else in the frame. His posture is rigid, almost unnatural, and the brim of his cap casts his face in shadow. You can't quite make out his features, but somehow, it feels like he's looking directly into the camera. The nurse doesn't seem to notice him, or maybe she's trying not to. The wind moves strands of her hair, catches the edge of her sleeve, yet the man's outline remains perfectly still. He's dressed in dark clothing, something that doesn't match the lighter uniforms of soldiers stationed nearby. There's no obvious reason for him to be in the photo, no sign that he belongs. But there he is, captured forever in a single frame. Silent, unblinking, waiting. The narrator's voice cuts into the quiet like a blade. For 40 years, no one looked closer. No one asked who he was, until one man did. The photo remains frozen on the screen, but the longer you stare, the heavier it feels. That small smile on the nurse's face, once warm and innocent, now seems almost wrong, as if it's hiding something. The man in the background doesn't fade away with time. In fact, the more you look, the more present he becomes. He's not in the official records, not in the hospital rosters, not in anyone's memory. Yet there he is, standing in broad daylight in plain sight, and no one ever came forward to say they knew him. The year was 1943, a time when Europe felt like it was holding its breath between one disaster and the next. The Second World War had already torn cities apart, reshaped borders, and rewritten lives overnight. The Eastern Front was devouring soldiers by the thousands, while the Allies pushed cautiously toward victory in North Africa and Italy. Bombers roared overhead in constant waves, their shadows stretching like claws across villages below. But for those far from the front lines, the war was no less present. It lived in the ration lines, the telegrams, and the empty chairs at dinner tables. Hospitals, especially those close to military zones, became places where hope and despair existed side by side, a fragile balance that could shatter at any moment. It was in one of these places that our nurse lived and worked. Her name will remain unspoken, at least for now. Those who remember her describe a woman of quiet warmth, someone who could calm a trembling soldier with just a few gentle words. She moved through the wards with a kind of grace that seemed out of place in such a brutal setting. Her hands, always steady, could dress a wound as easily as they could tuck a blanket under a weary patient's chin. She was young, barely in her 20s, yet she carried herself with a calm that older nurses envied. There was something almost luminous about her, a softness that seemed immune to the ugliness around her. But beauty and kindness were not shields in 1943. If anything, they often drew the gaze of strangers whose reasons for watching were not always pure. Life in a wartime hospital was a strange mix of order and chaos. The smell of antiseptic clung to every surface, masking, but never quite erasing, the coppery scent of blood. The air was filled with the muffled groans of the wounded, the rasp of saws from makeshift surgical rooms, the hurried footsteps of medics on gravel paths. Outside, The rumble of trucks bringing in fresh casualties could be heard at all hours, while overhead, the distant thud of artillery reminded everyone how close the front really was. Nurses and doctors worked in 12-hour shifts that often stretched to 20, their uniforms stained, their eyes red from sleepless nights. And yet, somehow, there were moments of stillness. Rare pockets of calm where someone might laugh, or share a cigarette, or write a letter home. Photographs in those days were not taken lightly. Film was scarce, rationed almost as strictly as food, and cameras were considered luxuries. Casual snapshots were rare, reserved for moments worth remembering, moments of joy, of celebration, of hope. That's what this particular photograph was meant to be. A young nurse, standing in the afternoon light, smiling for a friend's camera. A brief pause in the chaos, a small piece of beauty preserved forever. No one looking through the lens that day could have imagined that the image would one day be studied, not for her smile, but for the figure lurking behind it. For years, the photograph lived a quiet, undisturbed life, tucked away in the stiff pages of a family album bound in cracked leather. The war had ended, the world had moved on, and the people in the picture became just names in faded ink. No one lingered on the details. No one thought to ask questions. The nurse's smile remained frozen in time, untouched by dust or decay, while the shadowy figure behind her faded into the background, literally and figuratively. Visitors flipping through the album saw nothing more than a relic from the past, a keepsake of youth and service in a time of chaos. The album itself sat on the highest shelf in a dim, unused room, its spine bowed from decades of neglect. It passed from hand to hand over the years, inherited by relatives who barely knew the people it portrayed. Some glanced at it during hurried moves or spring cleanings, pausing just long enough to remark on her beauty before slipping it back between the pages. The man in the background, blurred, indistinct, was never mentioned. Perhaps no one noticed. Perhaps no one wanted to. In a way, that silence was fitting. Wartime photographs were full of strangers. Fellow soldiers, townspeople, workers in the distance. No one questioned them. No one expected every face to have a story. And yet, there was something about this one. If you looked closely, closer than most ever did, small details began to unsettle the eye. The figure seemed to stand unnaturally still, shoulders squared in a rigid posture. His face, though half in shadow, appeared to be turned not toward the camera, but directly toward the nurse. The light fell strangely on him, almost as if he didn't belong to the same moment, the same place. But in the 1940s, and for decades after, such things were dismissed as quirks of photography. Film could smudge, shadows could play tricks, and so, for nearly half a century, no one gave it a second thought. That would change in the late 1980s. A local historian, working on a project to document the personal histories of World War II medics, stumbled upon the image while interviewing a distant relative of the nurse. He had been cataloging letters, medals, and photographs for months. But when this particular photo slid across the table, he paused. His eyes narrowed, scanning the background. Then he leaned in, his expression shifting ever so slightly. "Who is that?" he asked quietly, tapping the blurred figure. The family shrugged. No one knew. And in that moment, the photograph's long, quiet sleep was over. The historian sat at his desk, the old photograph scanned and enlarged on the glowing computer screen. At first, it was just routine, another step in documenting the lives of wartime medics and nurses. But as the pixels sharpened, he found his attention drifting away from the nurse's faint smile to the man standing behind her. Something about the way he occupied the space was wrong. His stance was too rigid, his posture too symmetrical, as if he had been placed there deliberately. The blurred edges no longer looked like the casual movement of someone caught mid-step. They looked intentional, almost staged. The historian leaned closer, adjusting the contrast and brightness. That's when he noticed it, the eyes. While much of the man's face was shrouded in shadow, the eyes seemed unnaturally clear, even in this decades-old image. They weren't looking toward the camera like the nurse. They were locked directly on her, unblinking, as though he had been watching her for some time before the shutter clicked. A chill crawled up the historian's neck. He told himself it was just an illusion, a trick of light and grain. But the longer he stared, the less convinced he became. Determined to identify him, the historian began combing through hospital rosters from the period. Names, ranks, and assignments scrolled past, but none matched the vague features he saw in the picture. He cross-referenced with military personnel stationed nearby in 1943. Nothing. Not even a hint of someone who could fit the description. It was as if the man didn't exist on paper. No records, no photographs, no trace in the archives. Every lead dissolved into nothing. That absence gnawed at him. In wartime, everyone left a trail, however small. Soldiers had enlistment papers. Civilians had ration cards. Hospital staff were meticulously documented. The fact that this man appeared in the photograph yet nowhere else was more than strange. It was impossible. The historian sat back in his chair, the hum of his desk lamp filling the silence. He stared at the screen, the figure's faint outline framed in the nurse's moment of joy, and felt the same question tighten in his chest that would later grip millions who saw the image. If he wasn't staff, then who was he? The historian's next step was to find voices from the past. People who had been there, who might remember the day this photo was taken. He tracked down surviving hospital workers, many now in their late 80s and 90s. Over tea in quiet kitchens and under the hum of nursing home lights, they shared their memories. They remembered the nurse instantly, her kindness, her laughter, her habit of tucking loose strands of hair behind her ear. But when shown the photo and asked about the man behind her, every reaction was the same. A pause, a furrowed brow, and then a slow shake of the head. None could recall anyone fitting that description. It was as though he had been erased from their shared memory. Puzzled, the historian turned to local archives, hoping that military rosters or municipal records might provide the missing piece. Days turned into weeks as he combed through brittle paper files and microfilm reels, the smell of old ink filling the air. Yet, every search ended in the same blank wall: no enlistment record, no medical staff assignment, no civilian registration for a man of that age and build stationed anywhere near that hospital in 1943. The deeper he dug, the more the figure began to feel like a phantom, a shadow that had slipped into the photograph without leaving any other trace in reality. Refusing to give up, he decided to study the photograph in detail once more, not for faces this time, but for fabric. Pulling the image up on a large monitor, he examined the man's attire closely. The coat caught his eye first. Thick wool, double-breasted, with wide lapels and high, stiff shoulders. It was nothing like the lighter, more practical uniforms worn by medics and soldiers in the later years of the war. Then there was the cap, rounded, with a short brim and a faded insignia barely visible under the grain. Something about it tugged at his memory. He brought the image to a military historian specializing in uniforms. After a long silence, the expert leaned back and said something that made the room feel suddenly colder. The man's coat and cap were not from 1943 at all. They were from 1916, a style issued during World War I, phased out more than 2 decades earlier. The stitching, the cut, even the insignia matched photographs from the trenches of the Somme and Verdun, not the field hospitals of the Second World War. The finding was not just unusual, it was impossible. This discovery opened a new and unsettling question. Could the photograph have been misdated all along? Was it actually taken during the First World War and simply mislabeled in the family album? The historian tested this theory, but it quickly crumbled. Multiple sources, including personal letters, hospital logs, and even the nurse's own handwriting on the back of the photograph, confirmed the date as 1943. There was no doubt about when it had been taken, which meant that the real impossibility remained. A man dressed in a World War I uniform was standing in the middle of a World War II hospital courtyard, and no one remembered seeing him. The historian stared at the printout of the photograph one more time. The nurse's faint smile still radiated warmth, but behind her, that blurred figure stood frozen. A relic from another time, impossibly present in a moment where he did not belong. The air in the room seemed heavier now, the hum of the overhead light sharper in his ears. If the records couldn't place him and history couldn't explain him, then where had he come from? The historian decided that if the man could not be found in records, Perhaps the answers were hidden in the photograph itself. He arranged for a professional digital restoration, feeding the brittle black and white image into a high-resolution scanner. As the pixels sharpened, subtle details began to emerge, details that had gone unnoticed for decades. The first was his footwear. In a courtyard where boots were scuffed, caked in mud, and dulled by months of wear, his looked untouched. The leather was uncreased, the laces taut, the soles without a speck of dirt. It was as if he had stepped into the scene from somewhere impossibly clean. Next came the matter of his stance. At first glance, he seemed to be simply walking past, one foot slightly ahead of the other, head turned toward the nurse. But as the historian zoomed in, his stomach tightened. The shadow beneath the man's boots was faint, too faint. The alignment of his heels and toes suggested he was mid-step, but his feet weren't quite making contact with the ground. The space between sole and earth was barely perceptible, yet undeniable. It gave the eerie impression of a figure caught between frames, as though suspended for a fraction of a second longer than nature allows. When the historian moved on to study the man's face, the feeling of wrongness deepened. The background around him was softly blurred, the inevitable product of old lenses and quick shutter speeds. And yet his features, though partly obscured by shadow, were razor-sharp. The crease above the brow, the pale glint in the eyes, the faint downturn of his lips, all rendered with a clarity that made them feel disturbingly present. The image seemed to resist the natural decay of time, as if this face refused to fade like the others. It was then, during a side-by-side proportion comparison, that the most unsettling anomaly emerged. The man's arms hung too low, fingertips brushing near mid-thigh when they should have stopped above. His shoulders, too, carried an unnatural angle, one slightly higher than the other in a way that wasn't quite injury, yet wasn't natural posture either. The proportions weren't enough to scream inhuman, but just enough to whisper it. Small differences that the mind tries to dismiss until it can't. The historian leaned back in his chair, letting the silence of his study settle over him. On the desk, the nurse's smile glowed softly from the print, but behind her stood a figure that now felt heavier, stranger, more deliberate. Each detail, the spotless boots, the half-floating step, the sharp yet shadowed face, the warped proportions, layered into a presence that no mere photographic coincidence could explain. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the man had truly been there at all, or if he had only ever existed inside the photograph. The first explanation was, on paper, the simplest, that the man was a wandering civilian who had somehow drifted into the hospital zone. In wartime chaos, people sometimes found themselves where they didn't belong. But the deeper the historian dug, the more impossible this seemed. Military hospital grounds in 1943 were tightly guarded, their perimeters marked by barbed wire and armed sentries. Civilians were not just unwelcome, they were forbidden. Even in moments of chaos, entry without clearance could mean imprisonment or worse. And yet, in the photo, the stranger stood calmly, his gaze fixed on the camera, as though he had every right to be there. The second theory was darker: espionage. Could the man have been a spy, passing through disguised as an innocent observer? Some believed that his sharp, unwavering stare toward the camera was a deliberate act, a silent warning to whoever held the lens. But the logic cracked quickly. A spy's survival depended on invisibility, on fading into the background. Locking eyes with a photographer in broad daylight was the opposite of discretion. And still, there was something in his gaze, not threatening exactly, but aware, as if he understood the moment would last far longer than the war itself. Next came a more technical idea, that the figure was nothing more than a photographic error, a product of double exposure. Early film could be tricky, and sometimes two moments could overlap in one frame, creating ghostly illusions. But when the negatives were examined under magnification, this theory collapsed. The stranger's shadow aligned perfectly with the nurse's, and his proportions were consistent with the environment. This wasn't an accidental layering of images. He had been there when the shutter clicked, or at least something had. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that the historian stumbled across a disturbing piece of local folklore. Villagers in the surrounding countryside spoke of an apparition known as the Watching Man, a silent figure said to appear during times of great bloodshed. He was described as tall, slightly stooped, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on those around him. The legend claimed he had been seen by soldiers in both world wars, always standing apart, always observing, never intervening. The stories painted him as neither savior nor threat, just a witness to human suffering, his presence an omen that the worst was yet to come. The folklore took a chilling turn when the historian found a photograph taken in 1916, during the Battle of the Somme. In the grainy image, soldiers stand in muddy trenches, their faces drawn and hollow. And there, in the far background, is a blurred figure, his posture and coat strikingly similar to the man in the 1943 nurse's photo. The stance, the angle of the shoulders, even the tilt of the head were nearly identical. 2 wars, 2 decades apart, 2 photographs, and possibly the same man. The discovery reframed the mystery entirely. If this was the same figure, he was no mere intruder, no spy, no accident of film. The possibility that a living person could appear unchanged across decades was absurd, and yet the visual evidence was undeniable. Whatever the truth was, it was slipping further away from the realm of reason and deeper into something the historian had never intended to touch. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the photograph was less a record of the past, and more a window into something that had been watching far longer than anyone realized. For decades, the woman in the photograph had been known only as the smiling nurse. Her identity was preserved in family circles but withheld from public archives, perhaps to protect her privacy, or perhaps because the truth felt heavier than anyone wished to share. It wasn't until the late 1970s, when she was in her 60s, that her name was quietly revealed in a local oral history project, Margaret Ellison. By then, her hair had turned silver, and her hands, once steady with bandages and sutures, trembled slightly with age. Yet her voice, soft and deliberate, still carried the weight of those years in the field. Margaret spoke fondly of her time in the hospital, of the camaraderie among nurses, the gallows humor that kept them sane, and the fragile moments of joy they clung to between the waves of casualties. She recalled the smell of carbolic soap, the rattle of stretchers over gravel, the way the canvas tents creaked when the wind passed through. But then her voice would lower, almost without realizing it, when she described the courtyard, the very courtyard where the photograph had been taken. In that quiet, she admitted something she had never shared with anyone outside her closest circle. "Sometimes," she said, "I felt as though someone was watching me." The interviewer had leaned forward, sensing something more. Margaret explained that it wasn't like noticing a guard or a passing soldier. It was subtler, stranger. She couldn't recall ever catching the person in the act, only the feeling. The prickling at the back of her neck, the weight in the air, as though she were part of a scene someone else was studying from a distance. When pressed, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just fatigue, the exhaustion that came with 14-hour shifts and endless nights listening to the wounded cry out. But then she paused, her gaze dropping to her folded hands. "It was different," she murmured. "I remember thinking it was a soldier, but not one I knew, and not one who ever made it home." The sentence hung in the air, and for a moment, she looked as if she'd said too much. Margaret never connected the feeling directly to the photograph. In fact, she claimed she didn't even recall that particular moment being captured on film. But when she was shown the image in her later years, her reaction was unsettling. She stared at it far longer than anyone expected, her eyes fixed not on herself, but on the blurred figure behind her. Then she simply pushed the photo away and changed the subject. No further questions about it were answered. In the years after the interview, Margaret lived quietly, never speaking publicly about that day again. She passed away in 1981, her story incomplete, her private thoughts locked away forever. And yet, the recording of her words remains, a fragile thread connecting the smiling nurse to the shadow that lingered behind her. Whether she truly knew more than she revealed, no one can say. But those who hear her voice can't shake the feeling that she was telling the truth, just not the whole of it. By the early 2000s, technology had caught up with the mystery. What once required a magnifying glass and guesswork could now be examined with forensic precision. The photograph, long stored in a fragile plastic sleeve, was scanned at an extraordinarily high resolution. The experts weren't looking for ghosts, just historical clarity. But as they began adjusting the image, pulling details from the shadows, something emerged that no one in the room was prepared to see. First, the nurse's smile grew sharper, the folds of her uniform crisp in the filtered light. Then, in the deepened clarity of the background, the figure took shape. His boots, dark and polished, stood out against the dusty courtyard. At least they seemed to, until one analyst frowned and froze the image. The soles weren't touching the ground. They hovered, clean and untouched, a small gap of nothingness separating them from the earth below. One technician suggested it was an optical illusion, perhaps a quirk of the film grain. But the more they enhanced it, the more undeniable it became. His shadow didn't match the others in the courtyard. It bent at a strange angle, as though cast by a different sun. Someone asked if the figure might have been standing on something. A crate, a step, but there was nothing there. The space beneath him was empty. Then came the most unsettling discovery. As the brightness was raised further, a faint section of the stone courtyard wall appeared. Not behind him, but through him. The outline of bricks and mortar bled faintly into his legs, as though his body was less a solid shape and more a thin veil draped over the scenery. In the sterile glow of the editing room, a hush fell over the team. What they were looking at wasn't just strange, it was impossible. Every test to explain it failed. The film negative showed no signs of tampering. No second exposure, no chemical anomalies, no mechanical errors. The image was exactly as it had been taken in 1943. And yet, the man in the background seemed to be there. And not there at all. No one in that room ever gave a definitive answer. But several of the experts, years later, admitted quietly to friends that the moment they saw the figure's boots hanging above the dirt, and the wall shimmering faintly through his form, they felt something cold pass through them. As if whatever was in that photograph had, for an instant, noticed them too. The screen fades slowly from black, and the original 1943 photograph appears once more. Grainy, sunlit, unaltered. The nurse's faint smile still fixed in time. Her hands folded neatly at her waist, her eyes just shy of the camera's lens. Behind her, the shadowed figure lingers, blurred enough to ignore, yet impossible to forget once seen. The image shifts, dissolving into the enhanced version. The smile remains, but now the truth in the background is undeniable. The boots hovering, the faint bricks visible through his legs, the strange angle of the shadow. Each detail sharpens like a whisper turning into a scream. The longer the image lingers, the colder it feels, as though the air between viewer and screen has thinned. The narrator's voice cuts through the silence, low and measured. Some say he was a lost soldier, a wandering spirit searching for the place where he fell. Others believe he never lived at all, that he was something else entirely, something that's always been there, watching. The photo fades back to the original, softer version. For a moment, it's almost comforting. A wartime nurse captured in a rare moment of peace. Almost. The narrator's tone deepens, carrying the final words like a weight. And to this day, the man in the background has never been identified. The image dissolves into darkness. A faint, almost inaudible sound creeps into the background. Not quite wind, not quite footsteps. Just enough to make the listener glance behind them. Fade to black. The music lingers for a heartbeat too long before silence claims the screen.